Welcome to Pigeon Racing World with Winners1. In Brisbane we have Dave Christensen. G'day David.
Hi Rod. Hello viewers.
David, besides racing pigeons, your work with the North Road Combine, what's your main profession?
Previously I was part of the air crew for a company called Air Research Mapping. It was an aerial photography, aerial survey company. Unfortunately I injured my back in clear air turbulence over Newcastle and had to find a new career. I applied and was fortunate enough to be accepted as an air traffic controller with Air Services Australia. I do that up until this current day, although I'm in a back office support function at this time.
You also, David, had some exciting news about the North Road Combine.
The North Road Combine is pleased to announce 5 prize money races. First $1,000, second $500, third $250, hopefully more, but guaranteed $8,750 in prize money at this time. These are on the Combine races for the 2021 North Route race season.
Last week we mentioned this week we'll have Colin Walker and a special guest from Europe. Because of so much great information with the Colin Walker interviews, we will hold back our Belgian guests to next week. As a veterinarian, you're recognised around the world. Most people know who Colin Walker is. But having that reputation, has that helped you in your own practice over the years? Being able to speak to these different veterinarians? Because overseas, Asian vets are a lot more of them, especially through Europe.
Yes, indeed. I don't think it's helped me directly as far as the practice is concerned, but I think having raced pigeons myself for like nearly 50 years now, not every year, but 50 years and 52 years since I flew my first race, I'm very familiar with the requirements of a racing fancier. Yeah, look, I think what it does help me with is I can put myself in their shoes, and and I understand what they need and can help them from that point of view, so that I realise the urgency with figuring out what's going on. I realise the restraint of the birds having to maintain their fitness and another impending basketing, and I know what it means to miss races as well. I hope that from a clinical examination I can then make an assessment of what tests are most likely to give us a diagnosis sort of economically and expediently. And so if you have someone come in and say a pigeon is short of breath, and it's the only bird in the team, so that can be anything from a respiratory infection, it could be some other problem elsewhere in the body that's interfering with the respiratory tract doing its job, through to oxygen delivery problems like an anemia. It can be through overexertion and elevated muscle enzymes. It could be a trauma, and the bird's got a few broken ribs and it's got a blood clot sitting in an air sac somewhere. So it's tricky. When I was hiring veterinarians to come and work in the practice, sometimes what you do is, what do you think, about this pigeon? And they would handle it, and something that might seem quite obvious to me, but just through experience, because I've been doing it long, would not be apparent to them. It would be apparent to you. You'd say, this bird's heartbeat is a little bit more prominent. Its respiratory pattern is not normal. It's a bit more laboured. So you sort of think, well, what are we going to do to figure this out? I think we're spoilt as veterinarians now because avian medicine is, in the last quarter of a century, has progressed so rapidly that there's such a range of diagnostics available to us. So before we had to make a clinical assessment and maybe a treatment trial based on what we thought was most likely from the bird's clinical signs. And we still do that, but now, if we've got any doubt, we can cast our sort of diagnostic net quite widely and say, well, what is going on here? Let's pull this in. So when we're running our blood profiles, like our biochemistry, hematology profiles, when I retired, if I drew blood in the morning and the courier would pick that up before lunch, we would have the results that afternoon. And this is like 33 results, full organ function tests, all the red and white blood cell parameters. If I drew blood in the afternoon, it would go in the night box and the results would be on the email when I got in the morning at 8 o'clock. So really, rapid diagnosis. So you sort of think, okay, we've got full blood profile, microscopic examination of a crop flush and fecal smear. If we were looking for specific diseases like chlamydia or salmonella, we've got these specific sort of antigen capture tests now, which literally take a couple of minutes, similar to the COVID tests that are done now. The molecular biology, what was molecular biology? It didn't occur, it wasn't a subject when I graduated, but now we can look for the specific DNA for circovirus, rotavirus, PMV, and others as well, and just say, well, is that involved or not? So it's quite interesting. One thing I found when I was working in Belgium, a lot of those clinics, maybe a broad generalisation, but some of the clinics that I saw the veterinarians work in, they were practising a little bit the way we were 10 years ago. Maybe that's what the fanciest expectations were, but this is my clinical assessment, here's the drugs, let's try that. And we'll still do that sometimes in Australia, but we've got such ready access to all of these diagnostics to be sure. And of course, the more diagnostic information you get, the better, because if you can say this is definitely what it is, once you know the diagnosis, you know what made it come, and if you know what made it come, you know how to prevent it happening again. So, for example, a really, really common thing that we see is you think, okay, the pigeons are just flying poorly, they're arriving, they're looking fatigued, in from a short toss, don't want to fly around the loft. You'll draw blood, and we find this parameter, a thing called PCV, packed cell volume, their red blood cell count's very high. And you sort of think, wow, that's really unusual. So pigeons have high red blood cell counts anyway, because their oxygen demands for their tissues are high. So the same as racehorses, and greyhounds have higher PCVs than normal companion dogs. But they're very high. So race birds should be, under 43, 44. So some of these birds have PCVs of 60 to 70. So the blood is carrying so much cellular material that it becomes really viscous, and it's, sluggish, hard for the heart to pump it through. Now, there's no way that you could know that just by examining a bird. But the usual thing that causes that is pigeons being exercised forcibly beyond their current fitness range. So the body is trying to figure out a way to carry more oxygen to deliver to the tissues, but it's a compensation mechanism that sort of goes overboard. And so it can work against itself. So once you've got that, those pigeons that are forced to fly, to try and force the fitness, are just getting worse and worse and worse and lost, And if the people use the same training protocol next year as they did this year, the same thing will predictably happen again. Got the same genetics, same lot, same treatment protocol. What's changed? The same thing will happen. But once you know that's there, you can then work on that as well. And another thing, creatinine kinase, CK, it's an enzyme that's released into the circulation when muscle tissue is breaking down. So it elevates, again, if pigeons are being worked overly hard. And so we can measure that and say these pigeons flew for 3 hours yesterday and 3 hours the day before. They look okay to me. Are they definitely okay, or are they really fit? You can draw blood and say, oh, the CK's fine. They're just really fit, you know. So you can make some very good assessments like that. The trap is that people think, oh, they've got no fitness, they're not right. I'm going to then give them one drug, give them another drug, and it's just, you get into sort of a negative spiral really. So we have our diagnostics now, and we can give very precise information and targeted advice.
In your own race loft. On a normal race season, and this year's not normal, do you find that you have a routine of testing, or your observation usually?
No, you've got to test. You've got to test, and but look, I'm not as conscientious as some fanciers. It's very, very simple. Like, they are clean, they're properly fed. And they're treated for coccidia worms, and they have moxidectin at 10th-year-old dose in their bath water every month or so. So there's no external parasites. They have all their vaccines that they should. But one of the challenges with racing pigeons is that they do mix with birds from lots of other lofts under stressful situations. If you had an aviary of valuable parrots, and you wanted to keep them healthy, and you went and bought another parrot from anybody, the last thing you're going to do is get that parrot of an unknown health status, take it home and put it into your healthy, valuable aviary. You're not going to do that. And yet, in a race loft, a third of the members leave every week, mix in a stressful environment that is really suitable for disease transfer in stressful situations, and come back. So you need to disease monitor, and I certainly watch them clinically, and I'll test them if I'm suspicious. But normally all I do is about every third week I just take a few birds up to the clinic and some droppings, crop flush them, fecal smear them. If I've got concerns, I'll do other tests as well. The only medicine I will give them is something for canker 3 days every third week. Really simple. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Canker is ubiquitous. It's spread through the drinker. Some birds certainly are going to have higher immunity than others, or a slight genetic resistance, but that's not going to apply to the team as a whole. And if you're using very short-acting nitroimidazoles like ronidazole, it's all out of the system 24 hours later anyway. So you can treat them Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, freshwater Wednesday. They go to the race on Thursday with no drugs in them anyway. So, and yet, the correlation between success in racing and, good control of wet canker is very, very high, so you need to do that. But that's all I do. And if I'm suspicious of something else, well, then I can just test for that.
The Australian Racing Pigeon Journal has been an interesting educational read since 1993, and still a significant way to keep abreast of the sport of pigeon racing. In each exciting monthly magazine, editor Jeff Howe brings together Australian and international articles. Join pigeon fanciers throughout the world who subscribe and enjoy the Australian Racing Pigeon Journal. Loft visits, training tips, pigeon strains, as well as health advice from world-renowned avian veterinarians are regular topics featured in this great read. There is nothing better than keeping a quality magazine on the shelf to read anytime.
So this is the stock or breeding loft rod. It's about 75 metres long altogether. It's quite a large loft, but we've got the space and I've got the time now to look after it properly, so I thought it was fine. So there's 30 sections, each 2 metres by 2 metres, and then each of those sections has a flight on the front of it. At one end of the loft there's 20 individual runs, and at the other end there's 30 individual runs. So 30 sections, 50 individual runs. What we're walking up now is the central service corridor, and in the middle of the loft I've got a store where I keep the seed and books and things like that. This was built from scratch by John Van Beers by himself. He designed it as well. He's done a fantastic job. Just look at the skill of the carpentry looking along there. If you're a degree out, it wouldn't look symmetrical, and it looks fantastic. I guess one of the things which guided the way we built this loft was stock lofts aren't often as cleaned as frequently as a racing loft, and if that doesn't happen, then there's the potential for them to get quite dusty, which isn't good for the pigeons or the fancier. And so we decided, so we've got this flow-through ventilation, which even though there's quite a few pigeons here, the air remains fresh. But each section that opens onto the flight, there's 2 doors that we can close there. So if we get really inclement weather, those doors can just be swung closed and the birds don't have access to the flight, and the loft can be made sort of warmer and cosier. All the drinkers are automatic and they're done from the outside. There's 2 tanks at the back of the loft that catch rainwater, and then each drinker has its own tap, and I can just walk around and clean from the outside. This is the store here. At the moment, no breeding, so I've just got all the hens this side, all the cocks the other. I do breed and exhibit fancy pigeons as well, so I've got about 30 Nuremberg larks, about 30 Damascenes, probably about 60 Syrian Tarbesh, and about 40 Australian Swabians. When I was a boy and first got the racing pigeons, I got some Australian Swabians then, so that's like 50 years ago, so I've always liked those, and I've kept them the whole time. But I show the fancy pigeons at the national show each year, and I think I've had sort of 20 national champions over the years, so I like breeding the fancy pigeons, but they just don't give you the excitement, that the race birds do. I guess, having all the room that we've got here, it means that the better pigeons, I can, pair them up, breed youngsters for stock, and just store those babies. I don't necessarily have to breed from them, but if something happens to the older birds, or certain of the breeders, identify themselves as being particularly good, I can then go back and I've got those young ones, just sitting there waiting. So it's quite good. It's a relatively easy loft to clean. I don't clean the whole 30 sections in one go. I usually do about 10 at a time, and each section probably takes me 10 or 15 minutes. So it's sort of manageable. But you need to keep on top of it. But it tends to work quite well. I have a lot of fun down here just popping around with the birds. So I've been racing here 4 years now, Rod, and I've been lucky enough to win 3 feds, and I've had 5 seconds. Each time I've won a fed, I've had 2 pigeons together, which is nice as well. So this is one of the fed winners. I think she's a really sweet pigeon. I liked her very much, even from the day she was weaned. So she won the fed from Griffiths with a couple of thousand pigeons competing, and that was her only race. A really unusual race history. She was tossing along, due to go to one of the 2s or 3s in the start of the season, and she actually came from a toss totally minus her tail, and so that took sort of a month to grow back, and by that time we were already at the 350s, 400s, and I thought, look, it's just not fair for that pigeon to go from tossing to such a long race, so I kept her for the comeback 3 and got 2 together, but she was first over the trap, and so she was credited with winning the fed. A lovely full-bodied, easy to condition, silky feathered pigeon. Her mother is a gift pigeon from John Shaw, and she's a direct daughter of his imported Gel Rosier cock. The father is one of the old Jansen pigeons, the James Bond Jansen pigeon, but just a really sweet, and she's a very, very calm, sensible pigeon in the loft, just really delightful.
This is very nice.
So last year she bred from for the first time. I paired her to a cock who got 5th fed on the second 200 and was then doubled back the next week, and I clocked him again and he got 20th fed, and so I paired her to him, and the baby's in the race team now to race. Yeah. When she came, it was a little bit exciting actually. She won the fed by a reasonable margin, about 17 seconds, which doesn't sound like much, but it's quite a bit on a 200-mile race. And I'd heard, being a long flyer, you know, like even with people like John Yates, 60 kilometres closer, Gary Manchell's 33 kilometres closer on the North Line, and so I'd heard that they were up around Listerfield, and I was actually counting down the time that I needed to have a pigeon, and just as usually happens, you sort of think, oh, no, I missed out, and suddenly I could see these 2 pigeons come, and I thought, good, and suddenly they threw themselves at the front of the loft, and in they went, and it all happened, so it's lovely. Okay, got there in the end. Okay, so this is a fed winner that's bred a fed winner. She was in the very first team when we started racing here in 2015. She was only weaned late March, and she flew the line, and but extreme late bred, didn't do anything really wrong, but just a pigeon in the team. But then racing as a 2-year-old, she seemed to hit the strap. So as a 2-year-old, I usually fly the 2-year-olds with their cocks on eggs, and so I set her on her eggs, and her first race was the second 300. I actually won that fed. I got 2 cocks together, and then 2 minutes later this hen came. Because she was in the other team, she could still be clocked, and so she got 13th fed that day, which was nice. So then resat her on her eggs and sent her to the 10 birder from Mount Hope, and clocked her, and she won the fed. I got 2 together. I was first and second, and she was the one that was first. So 13th fed and first fed. Her number is 98. Her nestmate is 25897, and he was a triple fed cock. Another brother bred a double fed cock, and she bred the pigeon that landed with the Griffiths fed winner. So she's a double fed pigeon, but a fed winner, has bred a fed winner. Nestmate's a triple fed cock, and another brother's bred a double fed cock. The father is a lovely Hooban cock, again a gift pigeon from John Shaw, and the mother's one of my older Jansen pigeons.
When sitting on eggs, is there particular time that you like them, if you're on like 10 days or
yes, yeah,
5
very
days?
much so.
What do you prefer?
So look, I'm a little bit unusual in that I do fly a good proportion of the birds on eggs. So the second time I won the fed averages up at Listerfield, I had a small separate loft with only 31 pigeons in there, and 7 of those 31 that year, got in the fed, including a fed winner and a 3rd fed 6 and a 9th fed national and all that, and I set them on their eggs, and the way we were organising it was you'd realise they'd be driving, you'd feel them starting to ovulate, getting a little bit puffy in the tummy, so no tossing, just let them do their thing, and then they would lay. And what I found is if you tossed them the first few days after they'd laid, they struggled. They came back and they looked sore, so I just let them sit for 3 or 4 days, and then once they'd been on the eggs 3 or 4 days, we'd toss them virtually every day, about an hour's toss. So my father was doing the tossing then, and so there might only be 7 or 8 pigeons that I'd have ready for him to toss, and he'd come and collect them. And living at Listerfield, we used to take them to Coonya Beach or to Werribee, just those pigeons, and they would come, and go into their eggs, and then we'd race them that way. So we'd try and get them sitting as close as possible to 10 days, so they'd be, lay 3 or 4 days off, then hard tossing and send them close to 10 days. If they got an easy fly, you could get double fly out of them, they'd be just as good, the next week. So if they're on the wing, it's a nice, warm, light, airy type day, and they're home in 6-7 hours, have a good feed before the loft gets dark and they sleep. That race could actually sometimes set them, and they do even better, the next week. You know, and I guess the thing is that I like with having them on eggs is that they become very reliable, very predictable. You know, you think that hen, you know her, when she's like that she does well, and so you can get her set, you know, again that way. So I quite like that rather than just going in and, you know, randomly picking pigeons or just, you know, purely picking them off fitness. A lot of races, you know, I think if a race is under 6 to 8 hours, they need to have a certain level of fitness, but past that certain point, I think it's motivation. You know, once you're over 7 or 8 hours, if they're not fit, they can't do any good. But it's not that hard to get a pigeon to fly 7 or 8 hours, and you know, you'd hope that most of the pigeons that you send are fit enough to stay on the wing for at least that long without really struggling. But it's the motivation, I think. We had one national up at Listerfield, and you know, that was really brought home to me. I remember in the national with the VHA that year, it was in the early 90s, there were 6 pigeons on the day, and that was all, you know, out of, you know, 2,000 or 3,000. I had 10 away. It's a 10 bird limit, and they're all hens set on their eggs. And so there are only 6 on the day, the 2 clock through the night, and they're both mine, and they're both hens set on eggs. And I remember I got up at 2 o'clock and looked down at the loft, and I could see a grey sort of shadow sitting in the fly. They hadn't been there at 11, and I thought, oh, that won't be a pigeon. Went back to sleep, you know, and I thought, oh, you know, can't sleep, it's a national, you know, there's 10 hens away. Got up at 4 o'clock, walked down, walked up the loft, put the torch on, there is the pigeon sitting there. Clocked her at 4:03 in the morning. But the amazing thing that while I was there, I looked out across the paddock, and I'll never forget this, it was a hen coming across the paddock in the dark about 1 metre off the ground. I thought it was an owl, and that pigeon flew into the fly, and I clocked her at 4:20. My father came round at 5:30 to watch the pigeons arrive from the race, and I said, already clocked the 2, you know. What? You know, and they were both hens coming to their eggs. And I remember that hen that was the 8th fed hen. She always used to be in the top nest box, and her cock always built really big nests for her, and she used to crouch down into the straw. And so I guess the game was that when I was cleaning around there, I used to pretend that I couldn't see her, and she felt really safe. And when she came from that one, you know, being an owl impersonator in the dark, she went into that nest box and back onto the egg. So she was thinking of that. Yeah. But you know, my 400-mile fed winner, my 500-mile fed winner were both cocks set on eggs. My 2 600-mile fed winners were both hens set on eggs, and one of those was, you know, a long time ago now, 1990, 5,700 pigeons from Colorado into a headwind. I clocked at 10:21 at Listerfield the second day, and that was a hen on her eggs. And my Clayton 600-mile fed winner, I had a cock that came in time to win the 6. It wouldn't go in, and he was on the back of the roof in the half night, and he was pooped. Clocked my second pigeon, that got 3rd fed, and he then followed her in and got 5th. But he was a cock on his eggs as well. I would have liked to have got him, because I could then say I'd won a 4, 5 and 6 with cocks on their eggs. But I won a 4 or 5, and Clayton's one with the other one. But anyway, so a very calm, you know, nice hen to race. You know, when I used to clean around a nest bowl, she'd wing beat me, and you know, every toss you'd think, oh, are they all there? And you'd look, and she'd already be on her eggs. So it was nice to see her do well.
Yeah, g'day guys, Richard Clement from the NCF Federation in Newcastle, flying partnership with my father Malcolm up here, and just wanted to comment today on a product that we've been using over the last couple of seasons called Protein Plus, which we sourced from Winners1 in Victoria. Protein Plus is a product that we started using in our stock loft as a trial product a couple of years ago. We were interested in how we could ensure that when our youngsters had those last few days in the nest before they went into the race loft, and as they went into the race loft didn't lose any body and condition. And we found that the product was particularly helpful with that, and we were very happy with our first trials. We used it then a little bit more in the stock loft, and found that over time our pigeons, particularly as they went into the 3rd and 4th round of breeding, weren't losing body and were still in really good condition at the end of the breeding season. So that was really a positive for us in the first year. Last year we used it in the race loft for the first time, We found it to be a really good product to help put condition back onto the birds and to help the birds build back up a little bit quicker than what they probably previously would have, without having to change their feed base too much, particularly early in the week. We've had a pretty successful couple of years up here, winning multiple club and combine and federation averages, and last year particularly was a record-breaking year for us, and we put some of that success down to the fact that we've been able to use this product consistently now, and we'd have no hesitation in recommending it for other flyers who want to try and aid that recovery period, particularly after a hard race or a hard toss.
Now, you touched on being in Europe. Can you give us a highlight of one of your trips?
Yes, look, Pigeon Racing's been very kind to us, and we've made a good number of veterinary pigeon friends around the world. And so last year we were away for about 2.5 months, and we went to a number of veterinary clinics, worked with a number of veterinarians, but we spent the most time with a veterinarian, Dr. Pascal Lano in Kortrijk in Belgium. And that was a real eye-opener for me, because a lot of his clients are world-famous fanciers, Eustace Smetcher, Gino Click. I would have paid to have gone there just to see these pigeons, and yet we were going around there working as veterinarians, and they were paying us to go there. It was fantastic. But I think the other thing that surprised me is the absolute workload that's there. So Pascal would pick me up at the hotel at, say, 7 o'clock in the morning, and the day would start. And so we'd go to the first loft, because the lofts are close. So you'd be 15 minutes in the car and you'd go to a loft, and they'd be expecting him. So it'd be, I've got this old hen that's not laying, I need some of the widowed cocks, crop flush, take some droppings, see what their coccidial egg count is, what's this funny lump, can you remove that? So we do all the sort of veterinary things at one loft. We'd get in the car, 20 minutes later we're at another loft, and we'd do veterinary work there. And so that would continue until about 12, and then so we'd be home visits to the various lofts, and then we would be back at his clinic, an hour off for lunch, and then he'd start consulting at 1 o'clock. But what surprised me is that he would then consult until 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And so as long as people were ringing, the instruction to the receptionist was don't turn anyone away. And so we would have people arrive at 11 o'clock at night with their race birds to be checked. And you think, my God, they must get home, go to bed, set the alarm to get up to go down to the vet. But it was just, standard work. They'd just come in and they'd say, there's a basket of pigeons, I think they're okay, check them and make sure. And so crop flush, fecal smear, clinical assessment, blood testing was common, draw some blood, run the biochemistry, haematology through, and it was just one after the other. It was just fascinating stuff. Long hours, starting at 7 and finishing after 9, 10 o'clock at night. So look, just really fascinating stuff. And so, like some of the lofts, there would be a section of 15 widowed cocks, but a row of 20 of them. And so 2 or 3 of those cocks would be checked. Pascal had the back of his car really well set up, mobile lab, mobile microscope, everything he needed there. The people would be ready for him a few birds in the basket, they check. And if, a few birds from each section would be checked, they're fine, so they're considered for racing, they're fine. These ones have got a lot of trikes, we'll treat those, and we don't consider those as potential race birds this weekend. So it's just very specific, targeted treatment. Obviously the way to go. So they're getting drugs if they need them, but they're not if they don't. So that was very good. But the other thing that Pascal was offering, which was fantastic, of course, is the artificial insemination. And what he was doing there is getting in these teaser cocks, often grizzles, whites, reds, things like that, performing a vasectomy. That's relatively straightforward surgery. The pigeons are anaesthetised, incisions made either side of the vent, and endoscopes put in. You can see the vas deferens. It's a white tube. It runs up and down, and a section of that's removed and the 2 ends cauterised, and so that pigeon is got intact testicles. He's still producing sperm, but nothing comes out. And so those teaser cocks were then being mated to the good hens, and of course the hens would bond to them, and when eggs came, the hen would think that she's mating with that cock that's been vasectomised. And of course they're not his eggs. And so then the good cocks would then be artificially ejaculated, and Pascal had that down to a really fine art. So you had the cock sort of crowing around in good condition, and without sort of frightening him, you just walk in and pick him up. Calm cock, X-race cock, had a lot of handling, and in a particular way you massage them, and then he would just squeeze either side of the vent, a little bead of sperm would appear, a little white bead. Have a micro pipette, put that into the micro pipette, dilute it down 10 times with an extender fluid, and then those hens that have been running with the cocks, so you mate them, some of them are going to ovulate as quickly as 6 days, but they're all going to lay by 10, so just start inseminating them from day 6, and each ejaculate would be enough to inseminate, say, 10 of those hens, and you had a little restraining device where the hens would be upended, slid into a little retractor that would open the vent, and a hen that's cycling, the entrance of the oviduct has very rich blood supply, so it appears like a bright pink sort of rosette, and you just have your semen in the extender fluid, the 10 doses there, just put that in the end of the oviduct and dose her, and she would go back in with the teaser cock, and 5 minutes later and nothing had happened. So she would lay on day 10. She's been fertilised by the good cock, and then of course when they're hatching they've got plenty of milk and they're raised by the other thing. So some of the more famous pigeons that we saw, and we did see some really famous ones there. One breeder, he was selling youngsters off this cock for 10,000 euros each, and with Pascal's effort he was breeding 100 youngsters, mated to a number of hens per year. And so that was $1 million in sales. So it's very easy to justify, the veterinary intervention and costs associated with that. So there's a whole lot of other things that can be offered to fanciers. And of course, in Belgium, fanciers aren't allowed to vaccinate their birds either. So that was a significant part of the work. But at other times, of course, we are down here in Australia, because of pigeon racing in Australia, we are, I think pretty well up with it. I found it really interesting that we had those pigeons die in Western Australia at the end of 2016. The cause was undiagnosed, and then the beginning of 2017, late 2016, early 2017, we had the same disease appear here, and yet in Australia, in Melbourne here, we were able to diagnose that. And when we'd diagnosed and told the world that the cause of this condition is in fact a rotavirus, then the researchers, particularly in Germany, thought, oh, okay, it's a rotavirus, is it? Let's test for that. And they found, oh, our pigeons have got rotavirus as well. And then because they had historical samples going back to 2010, they found that our pigeons have actually had this rotavirus infection. We can identify it in these samples for at least 6 years, but it wasn't diagnosed there, but it came to Australia. And I remember I had a meeting with Chief Veterinary Officer Charles Milne in Victoria, and with Stephen Kearsey, and we met him and his minders and explained to him what was going on. This was on the Tuesday, the first cases had been on the Friday. And by the time I drove home from his offices at Mill Park, which is an hour-and-a-half drive, I already had an email from the head of service at Agribio, the diagnostic arm of DPI, saying, what can we do to diagnose this? And so they did electron microscopy, virus cultures, plus all the histopathology and things like that. But once they sequenced it out, initially they realised it was down to the family reovirus, and then it was actually a rotavirus. And so we then diagnosed this condition really for the world. So it was quite interesting. And then now, as they've been able to sequence it, rotavirus has been identified as the cause of young bird disease. So historically, young bird disease was a circovirus infection causing immunosuppression and a whole range of secondary things, notably nasty strains of E. coli. But if you get young pigeons, or pigeons, because it doesn't have to be young birds, just cause young bird disease because that's when they normally are exposed to the virus. If you give them circovirus and E. coli, they don't get young bird disease. but if you give them rotavirus, they get young bird disease. So that's really quite fascinating. And I think with our vaccine development here, so we've got rotavirus vaccines available in Europe, but they're very crude. All they are is just, we identified this rotavirus from this loft, we've killed it, so it can't cause disease, but presumably the immune system is still exposed to the proteins on the surface, so we're injecting it back into the pigeon. There's been no trials to see whether it's safe, there's been no trials to see how effective it is, and yet that vaccine's being marketed there. And because it was registered, able to be registered as an emergency thing with those, under those circumstances, in an Eastern European country, that country is part of the EU, that vaccine can now be sold in the whole of the EU. Conversely, here in Australia, Mark White at Treadley has made this subunit vaccine. We know through the trials that we've now conducted here that that vaccine forms demonstrable immunity, but it doesn't form 100% protective immunity in all birds. And so we've been able to show that it lessens the severity of the disease if they're vaccinated, and that many birds are totally refractory to infection. Pigeon fanciers in Australia still have to get their head around that. They sort of assume, oh, the vaccine's not working because some birds still get sick after using it. It gives them immunity, but it's not fully protective in 100% of birds. But the thing with the vaccine we have, it's a subunit vaccine, so considerably more sophisticated. So, DNA vectors, little enzymes are used to cut out the part of the rotavirus genome that we know codes for the VP8 protein on the rotavirus capsid, and it's exposure to that VP8 protein that stimulates the pigeon's immune response. So we don't need exposure to all the rest of the virus, just that little thing. So the part of the genome's cut out, it's put into an E. coli, we make a genetically modified E. coli. The reason for doing that is that the virus is very hard to grow, the E. coli is very easy to grow, a couple of generations overnight, and so you can then go in the next morning, kill off the E. coli, get rid of the E. coli, all you're left with, all that debris is gone, it's just left with the VP8 protein, and that's what you need to inject into the pigeons to make them immune. And so you're giving this subunit vaccine, there's no risk of reversion to virulence, or we didn't kill it properly, or there's parts of the virus that might cause damage, the same as the vaccine in Europe. We're just giving them that filtered protein that we know stimulates immunity. There's no risk of them getting the disease and harming them or anything. So a much more sophisticated virus. So I think even though, people don't readily associate the southern part of Australia with pigeon racing, I think we're doing our bit.
The Australian Racing Pigeon Journal has been an interesting educational read since 1993, and still a significant way to keep abreast of the sport of pigeon racing. In each exciting monthly magazine, editor Jeff Howe brings together Australian and international articles. Join pigeon fanciers throughout the world who subscribe and enjoy the Australian Racing Pigeon Journal. Loft visits, training tips, pigeon strains, as well as health advice from world-renowned avian veterinarians are regular topics featured in this great read. There is nothing better than keeping a quality magazine on the shelf to read anytime.
Meredith, what's it like living and being married to Colin Walker?
It's always very interesting. Always lots of ideas and activities. It's never boring. Yes, it is busy. But it's good.
Now, I've never known Colin to raise his voice in any way, or he's always kept a very calm manner.
Is he like that when no one's around?
Well, everyone has different reactions to different stresses. So no, there is this other side to Colin Walker. I sometimes listen to him when he's on the phone to clients. And I think, oh, he's dropped into veterinary mode, and then there's pigeon racer mode, and then there's sheep farmer mode. But yeah, he can get angry. You don't want to be around when he's angry. But he's not a brooder. He explodes, and then it's over. And he's sometimes rather puzzled why everyone else is kind of reeling from the wake, and he's moved on.
Does he do the dishes?
No. But he does other things. He does other things. And we have probably a fairly traditional breakup of responsibilities, which have largely arisen because of his work as a vet. And he would work very long hours. He'd go off to work. He'd be gone by 7:30 or so, and he wouldn't come home until everything was done at the clinic. And he would sometimes ring at 8 or 8:30. So I've only got a few more phone calls to make, and I'll be home. And he'd appear maybe an hour and a half later. So we would often have tea at 9:30 or 10. It's I've lost track of the question now. What was the question?
Does he do the dishes?
Oh, that's right, the breakup of work. And so, at home, it was my responsibility. He was never there to sort of do all those domestic things. And I have a cousin whose husband worked in the bank in the city, and he would come home and it was his job to bathe the kids. She'd be furious if he got home too late to bathe the children. Well, it just wasn't ever in the sort of range of possibility for Colin to be involved in bathing the children. The children would be well and truly in bed by the time Colin got home. So over years and years, it's evolved that I do largely the domestic stuff, and Colin does the birds and now the sheep, and now where we live, there's all that kind of farming activity. So he does that. But it works quite well, doesn't it?
I think so.
Now, you haven't just been Colin Walker's wife, you've also had your own career.
Mm.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, Colin and I met at university, and we were both doing a science degree at the time. And I majored in botany and did honours, and then I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do at the end of honours, and I kind of toyed with a number of alternatives, but then decided I'd get a job and sort of decide while I was working what direction I'd like to take. So my first job was at RMIT. My role was a course advisor, but really what I was doing was developing correspondence courses for at TAFE level. And I did that for about 12 months. And my honours supervisor got in touch with me and he said, oh, there's a job going at CSIRO for a science editor. I think you should apply for it. It's with the Australian Journal of Marine and Freshwater Research. And I'd done my honours in marine botany. And I thought, well, I could do that. So I applied for it and I got it. So then I worked for about 8 years as a science editor at CSIRO. Then I was pregnant with our first child and took maternity leave, and when Christopher was a year old, rather than going back to CSIRO, I decided that I'd rather have a sort of change of direction. So I started doing a master's degree in landscape architecture, so at Melbourne Uni. And so I did that over the next, must have been about 10 years, part-time. So I'd do a year and I'd have another baby and I'd have a year off, and then I'd go back and I'd do it a couple more years, and then we had James, and when James was about 18 months old, it kind of depended upon the availability of the subjects as to when I would resume the master's course.
So she's raising 3 young children and pursuing a tertiary master's degree.
So I continued that. So while the children were little, I was doing this master's degree, and then I finished that when James finished kinder. So James went off to school, and I got a job as a landscape architect with a suburban practice. So I did that for a few years, but I found that it wasn't really very intellectually stimulating. The work was interesting, but it was a small practice, and so the projects we had were rather modest. And I realised that I could earn enough money if I had a scholarship to do a PhD, as I was working part-time as a landscape architect. So I decided I'd do a PhD, and I did a PhD at Melbourne Uni in landscape architecture, and my project was looking at public perceptions of freshwater wetlands. And the reason I did that was I spent a lot of my time in the car driving the children around to all their various activities, and I was kind of struck by the number of residential developments that were being established with a wetland associated with them. And I thought how very surprising. Often these subdivisions with the wetlands were in areas that had previously been drained, and I thought, so we've kind of gone full circle. For example, down at Keysborough, there's a very large subdivision called the Waterways, and it's this huge wetland that's been built at a vast cost, millions of dollars, where once there had been a wetland on Karam Swamp. And I thought, well, isn't that fascinating? What do the people who are living in these residential developments think about these wetlands, given that up until recently the kind of conventional wisdom was that a good wetland is a drained wetland. So that was why I decided to do that project. So I did that, a mixture of part-time and full-time, as the children were at school. And I finished that, actually, again, as James finished year 12. And so then I saw an advertisement for a job at Monash Uni as a research fellow, postdoctoral research fellow, and they wanted someone to do a project looking at risk perceptions of urban water practitioners towards alternative urban water systems. And I thought, I could do that. I've been doing community perceptions of wetlands, and this is risk perceptions of water practitioners. It's all perceptions and watery issues. So I applied for that and got that job. And so then I worked for 6 years as a research fellow at Monash Uni. And so that then brought us up to about 2015.
When we were retiring.
Well, he was retiring. And so I decided I wanted more flexibility. So the contract, I ended up having a number of contracts. Originally, the contract was for 12 months, but it was extended. And it came to the point where that project, the risk perception project, was then followed by another project in which I studied kind of community perceptions of rain gardens. And rain gardens, they occur now quite commonly in suburbs as a sustainable stormwater management device. And again, they involve changes to streetscapes, changes to suburbs as we know them. And I was interested to understand what people thought about them, because if people don't like them, they're unlikely to be cared for. And if they aren't cared for, then they're not going to function effectively. So then there aren't going to be the benefits that were, aspired to by building these rain gardens. Anyway, so that project had come to an end, and I was offered a number of other positions at Monash, but I thought, no, what I want is more flexibility. I still wanted to be involved in some kind of intellectual endeavour, but the money side of it wasn't so terribly important by this stage. So then I had been within geography at Monash, so I approached the professor of geography at Monash and suggested that perhaps I might have an adjunct position. And so they agreed to that, and I did an adjunct position in geography for about 18 months. But then I saw this really fascinating project called RISE, which is being managed out of the architecture, design and art faculty at Monash Uni. And RISE is a very big project, international researchers with millions of dollars funding from the Wellcome Trust, and they're looking at the revitalisation of informal settlements in their environment. So this project has a number, it's a kind of proof of concept, and the idea is that in informal settlements like shanty towns or slums, and the case studies are in Fiji and Indonesia, instead of having sort of what's termed grey infrastructure, the sort of big pipe solution for water management, be that sort of water supply or sewage or stormwater, sort of biological systems or green infrastructure would be used instead. And so, for example, instead of stormwater systems, you'd have the rain gardens, as we have here in Melbourne, constructed in these informal settlements, and they could then be used, for example, for crop production perhaps as well. So they'd be multifunctional. And the idea was that by using green infrastructure in these informal settlements, the residents' health and their well-being would be improved. And so it's very much, the project is very much targeted at the well-being of the residents and how green infrastructure can enhance it. So I approached the professor at MARTA and suggested to him that he might have some small role that I could play in that particular project. And when he got over the idea that I didn't want any money, that I just, I wanted to be involved, and I sent off my CV, and I've had quite a few papers published, and with my editorial background as well, as architects working in this particular project. He and some of his colleagues felt a bit nervous about the funding requirement that they publish in peer-reviewed journals. Most of their research to date has been what's called design-based research, so that rather than empirical research, which is more the sort of stuff they're required to do now, and it's more in my background. So he was quite keen, I think, to get me on board for help in kind of framing up papers and writing them. So I've been doing that for the last probably 3 years.
But you got the President's Award as
well? Oh,
well.
yes. So I'm chair of the Environment Committee of AILA, which is the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects. And I've been doing that for a few years. And out of the blue, I got the President's Award.
I'd like to thank you, Meredith and Colin, for inviting us to your house and being on Pigeon Racing World with Winners1.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed part 1 and 2 of Colin Walker. Colin Walker in series 2 will be a special guest in the studio talking about the different health issues of pigeons. It's good night from Dave Christensen and myself. You've been watching Pigeon Racing World with Winners1.
If you have not already, hit the subscribe button and ring the little bell. New videos every Sunday.